the legislation to President Biden for his signature. Joining us now is NPR congressional correspondent Claudia Gonzalez, who is on Capitol Hill. So Claudia, let's just start with the package itself. Tell us what's in it. It would provide $60 billion to Ukraine, more than $25 billion to Israel, and $8 billion for Taiwan. And there's also a series of provisions for example, forcing Chinese parent company to sell the popular video sharing app or be banned in the U.S. within a year. The Senate leaders are really seeing this moment as a victory for this bipartisan unified push on this aid. The Senate was expected to be gone this week, but now they plan to stay in session until this gets done.
Unified push is not a phrase we hear too often in Congress. More about that. I understand that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has been putting on the word on his fellow Republicans who oppose this effort.
Right. A reminder that the Senate has a similar bipartisan aid bill in February, so now they're finally moving forward on this. And McConnell did have extensive remarks today with reporters, and he did blame President Biden's administration for some foreign policy stumbles and other disagreements, but he also took aim at members of the party, as he mentioned. He blamed former Fox News host for calls unionizing Ukraine, and he condemned Republicans to drag their feet here. He said that's why it took a while for some to come around to approve this aid. He said his party has a tendency to be isolationist when there's a Democrat in the White House, referring to President Biden currently. But he said this is a new moment.
So I think we've turned the corner on the isolationist movement. I've noticed how uncomfortable proponents of that are when you call them isolationists. So I think we've made some progress, and I think it's going to have to continue because we got big problems.
And today we saw a vast majority of Republicans approve a procedural vote to bring this package to the Senate floor.
And Claudia, I mean, there were many moments that it did not appear that this aid would make it out of Capitol Hill. So tell us how we got here.
Right. There were so many moments it didn't seem that we would come to this to see the Senate take this up. The major holdup were hardline Republicans who were adamantly opposed to the aid for Ukraine. And for several months, we saw these Republicans in the House oppose Speaker Mike Johnson when he started to take steps to push this aid forward. He actually reversed his own position on it. He was following their lead initially. Now, these hardline Republicans are furious at him for relying on Democratic votes to help advance this plan. They sought passage this past weekend. Some have even threatened his job, so a reminder that the fallout from this could still be in the making when Congress returns later this month.
NPR's Claudia Gonzalez, thank you.
Thank you.
The first way to make money off video games is obvious. You sell them to players. But another way started gaining popularity a little over a decade ago: in-game purchases. It's a typical part of what is called the live service model. Our colleagues at The Indicator from Planet Money, Darian Woods and Waylon Wong, explain how it works and why a growing number of players are pushing back.
In 2012, Rebecca Ford was part of a team that had spent years making a video game. The problem was they couldn't sell it to their game.
We had to make a paycheck for our team that month, and if we didn't have a way to support ourselves, it was all going to collapse.
Rebecca is a creative director at the games developer Digital Extremes, and the company was kind of like a band that had spent years toiling away on a beautifully orchestrated album, and now no labels wanted to have them. So Digital Extremes went indie. They self-published this game called Warframe.
And with this newfound freedom, they released it in a type of way that was gaining steam in the games industry. Instead of selling a one-off game to purchase, this game would be free to download.
And if you like it, you can buy some in-game currency, and we'll update the game as often as we can to make it worth your investment.
In 2012, when Rebecca's company decided to release Warframe with a relatively new live service model, she was thrilled. That meant servers, round-the-clock chat, and ways to accept payments inside the game.
Almost like building the plane as it's running.
That is exactly what happened.
And she sought help from players of the game. Rebecca thought that there needed to be a feature for players to give ideas for updates. Player feedback was critical, especially when dealing with the sensitive issue of money.
So in the game, maybe you could pay real dollars for a new sword that gives strange new powers. Or you could buy a special character who controls fire. Rebecca thinks back to this one particular purchase option that backfired.
A player could spend $1, let's say, to double the strength of their character. And then players got really mad.
It felt unequal, unsportsmanlike, and so they gave players a way to do the same thing, but for free.
And this ability to change paths is the advantage of a live service model game. You can be constantly tweaking and iterating. And while adding features, the company noticed one paid category was changing your appearance.
We started adding things like scarves or alternate helmets. Those are the types of things that really do impact our ability to be a stable place that can have a payroll department.
For a lot of games, cosmetics are one of the biggest sources of revenue.
And that revenue comes from just a few players. In Warframe's case, only about 10% of Warframe's players pay anything at all. In the gaming community, the top players are called whales. They sustain large ongoing production teams, which can be expensive.
Warner Brothers Discovery publishes games like Hogwarts Legacy and Mortal Kombat. And this year, the boss said that they want to lean more into live service games because it reduces volatility for the company. Instead, they have one title that is doing particularly poorly at the moment, that is Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League.
And that might speak to a growing fatigue with live service games from gamers.
Rebecca says criticisms of the live service model especially when the games haven't been done well by companies simply trying to make money. Think about other games. You might pay $80 and that's all the company will ever get from you.
But for a free-to-play game, there is no limit. Like, if I look at my lifetime spend in Warframe, the game I make, I have spent over $1,000 in my own game.
When that monetization becomes outright predatory. In 2022, the FTC accused Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite, of tricking users into paying money inside the game. The game accused $245 million in refunds.
The lesson seems to be that too much obsession with money can backfire.
Waylon Wan,
Jerry Woods and Garden Woods.
And if you want more stories like this after holidays over, so we'll series this week, Decoding Economics Security.
Planet Money comes from Schwab. This Schwab investing like artificial intelligence, renewable energy, or pet passion. Over 40 themes to invest in. Learn more at schwab.com. You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
For Connecticut Public Radio on South. This week, journalists with the New England News Collaborative are telling stories about how we can adapt our homes to help deal with climate change. With more precipitation in New England and more intense storms, some property owners are taking action to prevent flooding. But as New England Public Media's Nancy Cohen reports, for some, the best choices may be counterintuitive.
Kent Hicks knows a lot more about buildings than the average homeowner. He's a general contractor and teaches sustainable design at UMass Amherst. But in 2011, Tropical Storm Irene taught even him a lesson.
I looked out the window and I saw that this hurricane thing was real.
Hicks lives right next to the Westfield River in an old grist mill in West Chesterfield, Massachusetts. Irene not only dropped a lot of water quickly, it uprooted trees. To protect his house, he got into the water.
I was pushing debris away. Logs were coming down until I got about up to my chest and I need to get out of the water.
The river rose about 10 feet. He was worried pressure from the water would push against the building and it would flood away.
It was when I feet up lifting the building up, it would have taken it over the door.
Since then, Hicks has re-engineered his building in a surprising way to let the water in. He walks through a double set of doors into the basement.
When the flooding hit, these doors will come open on this side and let water flow through here. So I'm not trying to stop water.
Across the basement, windows would also serve as water vents. The idea is to allow floodwaters to enter the house and rise and fall with the water outside, so that the pressure of the water is equalized and the house isn't carried away. It may sound extreme, but even FEMA recommends what it calls wet floodplains in some circumstances, but most people try to keep the water out. Craig Leader has been able to do that for about 25 years by installing drains and sump pumps in basements.
Now we're running full force 12 months a year and times gasping for air trying to keep up.
Leader is keenly aware of the impact of a changing climate.
Just by how our rainy seasons are, our winter seasons are.
Leader's company installs systems that can withstand extreme weather. Mike Davis in Florence, Massachusetts got one after he had a flood.
I had 3 inches of water in the basement covering everything, including the furnace.
That was in 2011, after an October nor'easter had knocked out power for about 3 million people, including Davis. He had a sump pump, but without power, it didn't work, so he grabbed a bucket.
In the dark, in the cold, I filled 5-gallon buckets over and over and over.
A few years ago, he installed a new system, 3 sump pumps, 2 on a backup battery.
I can even test the battery and test the sump pump to confirm that it'll work if the power is out.
That cost him $3,000 out of pocket. That personal expense is common, according to Alex Wilson of the Resilient Design Institute in Vermont. Wilson says adapting to climate change should be a high priority, but there isn't much public funding.
Most of the funding that's available is only after the fact.
He says insurance companies should incentivize measures to prevent flooding. Homeowner Mike Davis also paid to reconfigure his gutters, and he replaced a concrete patio with grass. Allowing water to filter into the ground is almost always better than having an impervious surface, says landscape designer Rachel Lindsay.
So this is a little bit of a tight space, but you can see the gutter coming down the side of the building.
She points out a system she installed in downtown Northampton, where water used to gush out of a gutter.
We installed an interrupter that's redirecting the water into this tank. The tank is then connected to a soaker hose.
A hose, perforated with tiny holes, releases water slowly in a narrow garden. She says water can cause problems when it's concentrated.
Water coming out of the gutter has a lot of force, and it can erode soil, it can get into your basement. If you spread it out and slow it down, it's not a problem.
And if water is slowed down, it can recharge the aquifer, a good strategy for addressing another aspect of climate change, drought. For the New England News Collaborative, I'm Nancy Cohen.
I'm Dr. Connect. The time is 4:15.
Support for environmental reporting on Connecticut Public Radio comes from the Connecticut Land Conservation Council, elevating land conservation as a tool in the fight against climate change. Learn how you can support nature-based climate solutions at ctconservation.org.
For a long time, the video game industry wasn't thinking about gamers with disabilities, but then one game added over 60 different disability options. It literally brought tears to my eyes. Something like this was never done before. What it takes to include more gamers tomorrow on Morning Edition. Listen from 5 to 9. Support comes from Yale New Haven Health.
Boost your brain health with these new Connecticut Public Online games. Crosswords, word scrambles, jigsaw puzzles, and more. Visit ctpublic.org/games and engage your mind.
The time is 4:50.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Juana Summers.
And Jerry Louise Kelly. We are excited in a minute to bring you an update on 15 billion miles away from beyond our solar system. But first, a story from Southern Maryland, where 3 middle school students are facing hate crimes charges for anti-Semitic harassment of a Jewish student. The hate crimes in schools are not a rarity, and how communities handle them is increasingly important. NPR domestic extremism correspondent Odette Rousseau reports.
Because the case in Maryland involves kids, it's sealed. The little that has been disclosed publicly has come from the Calvert County State's Attorney, Robert Harvey. His office filed the charges and put out a press release.
The public understand this kind of behavior is just intolerable.
Harvey claims that 3 13-year-olds and 3 younger kids began harassing a fellow Club Point middle school student in December.
Throwing swastikas
aware of any threats of violence. But he says it got to the point where the victim and her parents reported the harassment to Maryland State Police. That's how it ended up on his desk. Prosecutors have discretion, especially when it involves kids. But Harvey says he felt he needed to charge the 3 13-year-olds with hate crimes.
I want to be sure that whatever happens to these young, that it meets my criteria, that they're be held to some degree accountable for what they do. I want to be sure there is accountability.
A youth of 12 or 13 should not be making hate crimes charges.
That's Brian Hughes. He heads the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University. Hughes says that while charging kids with hate crimes may be surprising, the possibility that kids might engage in this kind of activity should not be surprising anymore.
Any child who has access to the internet, especially unsupervised access to the internet, is going to encounter neo-Nazi propaganda very quickly.
And not just neo-Nazi propaganda, but racist and misogynistic ideologies as well. Hughes says people involved in them are meeting kids where they're at.
There are groups that specifically hang out in Roblox, which is a very popular game with preteens.
As national attention has recently focused on claims of anti-Semitism on college campuses, the fact is that historically, reported hate crime events have occurred more often at elementary and secondary schools. The FBI's latest breakdown shows that in 2022, there were roughly 900 reported offenses at those schools. Most have targeted black people, but anti-Jewish offenses come after that. Calvert County school officials did not respond to NPR's questions about how much the schools and staff knew of the alleged harassment and what, if anything, they've been doing about it. The statement simply said that all complaints are investigated promptly and could result in disciplinary action. Mary Vaughn says there also may be another factor playing into this.
I also think COVID had a really detrimental effect on students' ability to develop those pro-social skills.
Bonnie has worked with students at some of the schools in the system. She runs the Calvert Peace Project, a nonprofit that tries to increase understanding and collaboration in the community.
Students aren't sure how to interact and aren't sure how to resolve their conflicts. And we've seen that complaint over and over with the administration, with the teachers, and with the students, that it's really difficult.
Bonnie says she wonders why the student and her family in this case felt they had to go to state police for help. It signals to her that there's a need for a more holistic, wider response.
If it's escalated to that point, then it's beyond just the schools. You know, it requires parents and religious and civic organizations, the schools, and other public institutions, and the community members themselves to say, this is not acceptable behavior. We don't treat one another.
Robert Harvey, the prosecutor who filed the hate crimes charges, agrees.
What I'd love to see is that we'll have a big school assembly throughout the whole county, and that they have people come in and address this, talk about it, show the kids. I don't know, I'm hoping that's the home of our community, but I just don't know.
The case of the Maryland
Spilker says everyone gathered together in a conference room early Saturday morning, nervously munching on peanuts.
And those couple of minutes just before that signal was coming back, 6:41 a.m., you could have heard a pin drop in that room.
When the signal arrived, everything looked good, normal.
Everyone just broke out in cheers and smiled. There was a huge celebration and such relief as well. Voyager 1 was back.
Voyager 1's first messages contained information on the health and safety of its engineering systems, plus its precious antenna.
It looks like the spacecraft is in good shape, much like we left it back in mid-November.
Spilker says the plan now is to find some more free memory on a working chip and put in the software that will let Voyager 1 resume transmission of its science data so that researchers will be able to follow along as the spacecraft travels through an interstellar stew of gas, dust, and cosmic rays. And the team ultimately hopes to sustain Voyager 1 and its twin, Voyager 2, for at least a few more years so that the Voyager mission will still be doing science on the 50th anniversary of its launch. Nell Greenfield Voice, NPR News.
Thanks for listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from C3 AI. C3 Generative AI works to enable rapid access to traceable, hallucination-free insights from enterprise systems. Using many
Intelligence, we will have the latest on how they're trying to do that coming up in the 5 o'clock hour here on All Things Considered.
Support for All Things Considered on Connecticut Public Radio comes from Kennedy and Perkins Opticians. We know you're relying on us for in-depth reporting and important public policy conversations. As a listener, you're supporting nonprofit journalism that insists on truth, transparency, and accountability. Thank you. This is Connecticut Public Radio, WNPR and WNPR HD1 Meriden, WPKT and WPKT HD1 Logan, WEPWF at Stanford, WRLI in Southampton, WPCS Willimantic, WVOF Fairfield, WPAQ AC4 Danbury, and W279CI Danbury. It's 5 o'clock.
This idea of having a home is not realistic, even at my age. Whether you're a renter or a buyer, finding a place to live can feel impossible when you look at factors making affordable housing feel unreached.
For Tuesday, April 23rd, this is All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm one son.
And I'm Mary Louise Kelly. Protests continue on college campuses due to tensions over Israel's war with Hamas.
That presents challenges for administrators focused on student safety.
Disturbing, and they're not unprecedented, but they really help to pay attention.
And we're wondering about his play country, which presents a young Vladimir Putin as an underdog.
It's sort of a one-way concept. Together, we can all coexist.
And a look at animals get so stressed out during the play.
NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. President Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial in New York has wrapped up today. Story from former tabloid publisher David Packer, a longtime friend of Trump's. There's another Steele reports Packer laying out his role in an alleged scheme to quash information. Could have been damaging to Trump and run to the 2016 election.
the former publisher of the tabloid National Packer, who was known since the decades, detailed how he met with Trump and others in August of 2016 to agree to help Trump's first presidential bid. Packer said that he agreed to publish stories about Trump, negative stories about his opponents, and report back any rumors of damaging stories, especially coming from women. Prosecutors argued that the Packer made would eventually lead to the payments made to adult film actor Stormy Daniels and Playboy model Karen McDougal. They say the payments were meant to silence the stories which were believed to be damaging to Trump's electoral prospects. The defense says Trump did nothing illegal. Jimena Bustillo, NPR News, New York.
Protests over Israel's war on Hamas in Gaza and in support of Palestinians continues on college campuses. At Columbia University, student protests over the high number of Palestinian civilian deaths been building for months, but stepped up last week with the arrest of more than 100 pro-Palestinian protesters.
Many Jewish students, meanwhile, say the protests are stoking anti-Semitism. The U.S. Justice Department has reached a $139 million settlement with more than 140 views by former USA physicist Dr. Larry Nassar. Michigan Public State Wells reports the FBI's lax complaints about Nassar, blamed for allowing the abuse to go on for a year.
In 2020, the then head of diagnostics went to the FBI's office in Indianapolis to report allegations that NASA had abused 3 young female gymnasts. USA's announced allowed Nassar to quietly retire from his role as team doctor at Michigan State University. The FBI had a whimsical role in interviewing only one of the young athletes at the time and failing to let the Michigan know about the allegations. By the time Nassar was arrested a year later on separate charges, he'd assaulted about 100 other athletes and patients, according to the legal complaints. The road to this settlement included a formal apology from the director of the FBI to USA gymnasts, including Olympic star Simone Biles. For NPR News, I'm Kate Walls.
Electric vehicle maker Tesla is wielding the giant tax again, facing slower growth this year amid intensifying competition from Chinese automakers. The company run by entrepreneur Elon Musk announcing plans to cut 6,000 jobs, facilities in California and Texas. That's released earnings after the market closed today that were lower. On Wall Street, the Dow rose 263 points. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Indiana University, committed to moving the world forward and working to tackle some of society's biggest challenges. 9 campuses, one purpose, creating tomorrow today. More at IU.edu.
Connecticut Public Radio news reports are made possible by the law firm of Heller and Sage. For Connecticut Public Radio, I'm John Smith. A controversial AI regulation bill has been approved by the Connecticut Judiciary Committee. Representative Steve Stasham is co-chair of the committee. He says the bill still needs to be voted before it gets to the floor of the House and Senate.
This bill does remain something of a work in progress. I know I received outreach both from the trial lawyers as well as from the Division of Criminal Justice with concerns even on the amended language.
The bill is aimed at regulating the use of artificial intelligence in business and prohibiting its use for deep state pornography and election misinformation. Government monitors supports the election measures, but worries about business measures blunting